Hello and welcome to this video. Today we will be answering the question, what caused fractures in the newly formed government? There's a lot to unpack, so let's get started. Part 1. The first fracture. The first split that we are going to be discussing actually occurs before the new government is officially agreed upon. When the Founding Fathers put forth their ideas for a new government and attempted to get the Constitution ratified, people generally fell into two groups: people who appreciated a strong central government because they thought it would lead the nation as a whole forward, and people who were afraid that a strong central government would interfere with states' rights and individual liberties. In other words, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. In an attempt to persuade the people that the government as laid out in the Constitution was superior to the government under the Articles of Confederation, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the Federalist Papers. But Anti-Federalists were still concerned. In order to move forward, the two sides had to compromise. The Federalists agreed to include a Bill of Rights if the Anti-Federalists would agree to ratify the Constitution. Immediately after New Jersey ratified the Constitution, the last state to do so, James Madison wrote the first 10 amendments, collectively known as the Bill of Rights. We'll be discussing those in more detail in a later video. Under the new Constitution, the government would be split into three branches: the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. The powers of government were split between these three branches so that none of them could become tyrannical. The first order of business was to elect someone to head the executive branch. We needed a leader, a president. General George Washington was unanimously elected to the position, and a lot of what he did in his time in office established precedents for how we still expect presidents to act today. Upon election, President Washington chose leaders of different viewpoints and dispositions to serve as his cabinet members. The cabinet is a group of advisors appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate that serve as the heads of different departments in the executive branch and as advisors to the president. One of these cabinet members was Alexander Hamilton, who was chosen to be the first Secretary of the Treasury. Secretary Hamilton was extremely concerned about the amount of debt the United States had incurred during the Revolutionary War. He also didn't like the fact that many of the states continued to act as though they were part of a confederation rather than a unified nation. In an attempt to rectify both of these issues at once and establish the power of the new central government, he put forth a plan to nationalize the states' debts. Before Hamilton, each state was responsible for paying off their own debts to wealthy citizens, foreign nations, and other states. What Hamilton proposed was that the central government would take all of the debts as its own, tying the nation together and making the United States credit more competitive in foreign markets. There was a lot of opposition to this plan, especially from wealthy southern states like Virginia, which had managed to pay off their debts because of their cultivation of cash crops and the use of slave labor. Despite the challenges from wealthy southern states, Hamilton pushed his debt plan through Congress by compromising and putting the nation's new capital, Washington, D.C., closer to the southern states. Hamilton also proposed a tax on the nation's citizens to help pay down the national debt, an excise tax on whiskey. Citizens who had just gone through a lengthy and expensive war for freedom from oppressive taxation were not happy with this new tax, especially those citizens in western Pennsylvania who distilled whiskey and already had to pay costly fees to transport their product over the Appalachian Mountains to harbors in New England. Farmers in western Pennsylvania followed in the footsteps of groups like the Sons of Liberty and began to intimidate tax collectors and arm themselves for rebellion. Unlike during the previous Shays Rebellion, the central government now had control of the military. Secretary Hamilton and Governor Henry Lee persuaded President Washington to authorize the use of the military to put down the rebellion in a show of force. This was supposed to show that the United States government was united and strong, but by the time the army actually reached western Pennsylvania, the rebellion had largely collapsed. 2 men were accused of treason and convicted, but President Washington later pardoned them. Still, this showed that the federal government could interfere in the states and in the lives of citizens, something that some leaders were not happy with. Part 2. The formation of political parties. In response to the actions of Secretary Hamilton and other Federalists like him, opposition formed. Led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who had switched parties, and together with other politicians, they created a political party known as the Democratic Republicans, partly because their goal was to protect the democratic ideals of freedom, especially for wealthy men like themselves. Soon, the president's cabinet had fractured. Congress followed in their footsteps, organizing into two factions, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. One of the issues that cemented the differences between the two groups was how they wished to respond to the French Revolution. French proletariats had risen up and seized control of the government and executed their king and queen. Federalists, like John Adams, did not want to get involved, preferring to focus on building up a strong nation before interfering in global affairs. Democratic Republicans, like Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, wished to repay the French for their aid in the Revolutionary War and also promote the ideals of democracy in other nations. President George Washington did not like that the leaders of the United States were splitting into parties. He went out of his way to try to get people to work together, but he was also getting old and wanted to retire from political life. After serving 2 terms as president, he decided not to run for a 3rd term of office, setting a precedent for how many terms a president should serve, while also facilitating a peaceful transfer of power, which was pretty remarkable at the time. During his farewell address, Washington specifically warned against forming political parties like the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. However, at this point, politicians realized the usefulness of forming alliances and voting blocs based around a specific platform, and we continue to see political parties as almost paramount institutions in American politics, and most other democratic systems in the world. So after George Washington decided that he was kind of done being president, Federalist John Adams was elected president in 1796 and took office in March of 1797. President John Adams did not have nearly the same amount of unanimous support as George Washington did, and the fact that the Federalists and Democratic Republicans were fighting over political influence made for some questionable decisions. The Federalists controlled Congress, fearing interference from France after a diplomatic mission gone wrong, passed 4 acts designed to help the Federalists consolidate power. These became known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts collectively made it harder for immigrants to become citizens because immigrants were more likely to support the Democratic Republicans, and basically made it illegal to speak against President Adams, the Federalists, and the decisions that they made. The Alien and Sedition Acts were hugely unpopular, and though they were repealed under the First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech and the press, these acts still sounded the death knell for the Federalist Party. Part 3. The Downfall of the Federalists. In part due to the actions of the Adams administration and the Federalists in Congress, Federalists lost a lot of popular support. The election of 1800 ended up becoming more of a competition between 2 Democratic-Republican candidates, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, rather than between the incumbent president John Adams and a challenger from the opposing political party. Thomas Jefferson won the very close election, and the balance of power in the young nation was transferred from the Federalists to the Democratic-Republicans in a rather peaceful fashion, though not without some drama. The drama in question came in the form of a suit filed by William Marbury against the new Secretary of State, James Madison. In the last days of the Adams presidency, he and the outgoing Federalist Congress pushed through a bill to create federal courts which they filled with Federalist appointees. However, the appointees couldn't begin their jobs until their commissions were delivered by Secretary Madison, which he refused to do. The case went to the Supreme Court, which at the time consisted of 6 justices instead of 9 like we have today. The court also functioned very differently at the time. The Constitution isn't very specific about just what powers the Supreme Court has besides the power to, judge things. During this case, rather than solve the question between Marbury and Madison, the Supreme Court established the precedent of judicial review by declaring the Judiciary Act of 1789 unconstitutional. Judicial review is the power to judge whether or not laws and executive orders are constitutional. Before this court case, the court's powers were rather weak and undefined, but with this ruling, the Supreme Court declared itself equally powerful to the other 2 branches of government, able to check the powers of the executive and legislative branches and keep power balanced between them. It was essentially a power grab, and everybody at the time was kind of like, sure, sounds legit. And since Marbury versus Madison, it totally has been. So Secretary Madison and President Jefferson got away with preventing a bunch of Federalist appointments and gave each other a high five and went on to have a pretty successful administration. We're going to be coming back to Jefferson's presidency in a later video to talk more in depth about how he began the push for westward exploration and expansion. Jefferson served 2 terms, then retired, and Madison was elected president in 1808. And that's when things get interesting again, because what the heck, we're fighting a war? Part 4, the War of 1812. So yeah, apparently we're fighting a war. The War of 1812, also called the Second War for American Independence, is probably one of the least glamorous wars we have ever fought, considering we accomplished basically nothing in terms of gaining land or territory. But it's an important war nonetheless for a couple of reasons. First though, let's figure out how the war started. In an age where Britain and France controlled the seas and were also fighting with each other, again, they did that a lot back in the day, the seas quickly became a perilous place for American shipping and sailors. Both Britain and France began a policy of impressment, where they basically sailed up next to a weaker ship, pointed their very large cannons at it, and said, "Congratulations, you are now going to sail for us and you have no choice." This, understandably, made Americans quite upset because Britain and France were infringing on American civil liberties and also interfering with American trade. So President Jefferson placed some embargoes on Britain and France. The goal was to hurt Britain and France's economies by refusing to buy from them or sell to them, which backfired. You see, the United States' main trading partners were Britain and France. And unlike the United States, Britain and France had a lot of trading partners, and they also still had a bunch of colonies that they could trade with. So us stopping trading with them didn't really impact their economies all that much. So that was quickly scrapped, and Britain and France continued to impress sailors, which was just plain mean. After President Jefferson's embargoes failed and the newly elected President Madison's trade restrictions also failed, some members of Congress began to loudly proclaim the need for war. This group of men, led by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, called themselves war hawks. They specifically wanted war with Britain because, in addition to their policy of impressment, Britain used its remaining connections with Native American nations to help them engage in defensive and offensive conflicts with Americans in defense of their land, which was constantly being invaded by American settlers looking for land and economic opportunities west of the Appalachian Mountains. They saw these actions as disrespecting our nation and stepping on our sovereignty. Others, who called themselves doves, opposed the Warhawks and were nervous about getting into a fight with one of the greatest military powers in the world. Again. Regardless, we ended up at war with Britain, most of which was fought in the United States and the British-owned territory in Canada. The war lasted for 2 years, and after a long stalemate, ended with the Treaty of Ghent, which re-established the previous borders. So militarily, nothing much happened during the War of 1812 except for some needless violence and death. Also, they burned down our brand new capital, which is just rude. That changed, however, with the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815. Wait, didn't I say that the war ended in 1814? Yeah, I totally did. News took so long to travel in those days that one of the most decisive battles in the war actually happened after the war had ended. Led by Major General Andrew Jackson, the American force routed the British, inflicting over 2,000 casualties while taking less than 100 of their own. News of the Battle of New Orleans and news of the Treaty of Ghent reached the American public at pretty much the same time, resulting in them conflating the two events and giving Americans new pride and feelings of unity in their young nation. So, in a nutshell, what did the war actually accomplish? Well, first it proved that the United States was a real nation, capable of ruling itself and defending itself against foreign power. Second, it launched Andrew Jackson into the national spotlight, paving the way for his later campaign for the presidency. Third, it unified the country's factions, resulting in what became known as the Era of Good Feelings. And lastly, it succeeded where the embargoes failed and significantly decreased the rate of American sailors getting impressed by the British and French. Part 5. Fractures, Factions, and Federation. So in this period of figuring out how to run a country, the nation's political figures set precedents, fractured into factions, and finally united under the Star-Spangled Banner, which was written during the War of 1812. So taking into account all that you've learned throughout this video, what caused fractures in the newly formed government? What do you think?